I was born where the birch trees lean toward the wind and the Daugava runs like a silver belt through the fields. My father used to say, the river remembered everything. Ice breaking in spring, hay floating after floods, the voices of men who had not come home from past wars. If you stood on the bank at dusk and listened hard enough, you could hear the old stories in the water. As a boy, I believed him. We were tenants on land that did not carry our name. The manor belonged to a Baltic German baron whose language tasted like iron to my ears, and whose dogs had better quarters than our cows. Still, the soil in our little strip was ours, in a way no deed could prove. We turned it with wooden-handled plows and our own backs, and by autumn, our rye stood tall enough to hide my younger sister, Lina, when she played. In summer, the air smelled of clover and horse sweat. In winter, it tasted of smoke and pine. My mother kept the house as neat as a hymn. Whitewashed walls, rushes on the floor, the icon in one corner from her Orthodox father, and a Lutheran catechism on the shelf from my father's people. On Sundays, we walked to the church whose steeple you could see across 3 parishes. Half the hymns were in German, half in Latvian. But the Lord, I decided early on, understood either. I learned my letters in a village school that existed because the schoolmaster loved us more than he feared the authorities. He taught us to read from tattered books that smelled of damp and glue. Sometimes he slipped a line of Rainey's or Aspazija into our copy exercises as if smuggling contraband, and we passed the words along like bread. There were days when he taught in Russian because the inspector might come. There were afternoons when, with the door bolted, he read out loud in Latvian until his eyes shone. We sat there with our hands ink-stained, feeling the letters lodge inside us like seeds. In Riga, they said, factories were swallowing boys I had known, machines teaching them to move their hands to clocks instead of seasons. I went once, selling eggs at the market on Maskava's Forstate, and saw the chimneys spit smoke into a sky that looked older than God. Tram bells clanged, the Daugava barges bumped and cursed each other in a dozen languages. I felt small and hungry there, and also a little proud that our river went through a city that people argued about in Polish, German, Russian, and Latvian all at once. When I came home, my father grinned and said, "Well, Janny, did the city eat you?" I told him it did not, though for days afterwards, the sound of trams rang in my ears when I lay in our loft. We did not forget 1905. I was a child that winter when men with scarves over their faces came at night and spoke in whispers to my father. After they left, he hid a pamphlet beneath the stove stone. A month later, the Tsar's men came riding, and the Christmas trees in our village squared their branches like soldiers when shots cracked in the next parish. I remember, sharper than any other thing, the smoke from a burned barn drifting across clean snow, like a stain that could not be scrubbed out. Some said freedom had knocked and fled that year. Others said it merely learned the road to our door. After 1905, the land quieted on the outside and stiffened on the inside. The manor sent stewards who spoke in orders. The gendarmes came less often, but looked harder at your face when they did. The school inspector counted how many lines in Latvian our teacher dared, and fines became as common as frost. There was talk of conscription always, like a wolf circling the sheepfold just out of sight. "The empire needs boys," the postman would say, tapping his bag. "And boys have legs." I was 19 in the spring of 1914, tall enough to see over the rye, strong enough to lift both handles of the plough, and foolish enough to think the world was a summer that would not end. I courted a girl from the next village, Elsa, who wore a blue scarf on market days and laughed like rain on a tin roof. We danced at Jani around the bonfire until sparks chased the stars. We sang the old Danas and stole kisses behind the hayrick, while the elders pretended not to see. That night, my uncle, already half drunk, threw his arm around my neck and said that all a man needs is a good horse, a good woman, and a good roof. War, he added, wagging a finger, belongs in songs. We all laughed and drank beer that tasted of rye and smoke. When the news of Sarajevo came, it was a whisper, then a rumor, then a storm. By July, the postman had stopped joking. By August, the church bell tolled long and slow, and the Baron's steward read a paper with a double-headed eagle stamped at the top. Mobilizacija, he said, tasting the word as if it were sour. The Czar had called, and the empire's wagon would take what it needed. Men lined up in their best shirts, eyes flint-bright, mouths dry. Some were proud, some angry, some simply stunned. German towns across the border were suddenly enemies. Cousins in Courland who spoke both tongues were suddenly suspect. The forester, who had always left extra logs for widows, climbed into a cart with his cap in his hands and did not look back. My father put both palms on my shoulders as if weighing me. "You belong to the land, Janet," he said softly, "but the land sits under an empire." My mother stood in the doorway, her apron twisted into a rope between her hands, as if she could tie me to the lintel with it. The first summons missed me by inches. Older men went first. I worked the fields with a fury that summer, as if speed could stave off the future. I learned the names of the German towns from the newspaper, Königsberg, Tannenberg, and the names of Russian generals from men at the tavern who spoke as though they knew them personally. "It will be quick," one said, pounding the table. "Home by the harvest." Another shook his head and wiped foam from his moustache. "No war is quick in mud." Autumn came with heavy clouds and heavier boots. Refugees from Courland passed our road with their lives strapped to wagons, staring at the horizon as if afraid their homes might come chasing them like ghosts. They spoke of German shells falling like hail, of fields torn up as though a crooked plough had ripped the earth sideways, of churches with their steeples snapped like candles. I watched them go and felt the river inside me rise. On a sharp morning in November, when the frost drew ferns on the window glass and our breath hung white in the kitchen, the gendarme's horse stopped at our gate. He handed me a paper with my name spelled careful and wrong. "Report to Riga," it said, stamped and signed, as if a city could hold my life on one sheet. My mother kissed my forehead and pressed a small cross into my hand that had belonged to her father. My father laced my boots as he had when I was a boy, the leather creaking like a sigh. I walked to the road with my pack on my back, the birches bowing, the Daugava watching. Elsa met me by the footbridge, her scarf the blue of a July sky we would not see together. She did not cry. She lifted her chin and said, "Right." I promised I would, though I did not yet know to whom my letters would belong. To her, to my parents, or to the river that collects all promises and returns them in another season. At the crest of the hill, I turned for one last look. The fields lay brown and obedient, the thatch roof smoked, the church steeple pricked the low cloud. Home, held in a single breath. Then I faced the road to Riga, to barracks and boots and numbers on a list. The empire had set its hand on my shoulder. I stepped forward into its grip, a farm boy with a cross in his pocket and the river's murmur in his ear, not yet knowing that before the war was over, I would be called a Latvian Rifleman, that I would learn the shape of trenches and the taste of swamp. that I would carry the names of fallen comrades like smooth stones in my coat. The Daugava ran on, silver under a hard sky, and I went to meet the future it had been telling me about all my life. Riga smelled of coal smoke and brine the morning I reported to the barracks. Ships along the Daugava wore grey paint, their masts like bare trees against the sky. The streets were crowded with carts, refugees from Courland, mixing with merchants and families who had come to see their sons off. Mothers clutched kerchiefs to their mouths. Fathers barked instructions no one would remember. Young men in patched coats jostled nervously in line, clutching summons papers like tickets to an unknown play. The Russian officer who took my name looked at me as though I were a log he might toss into a river. Berzinch, he said, flattening the vowels. Second Army Draft. You'll learn Russian quick enough. He shoved a pen into my hand and pointed where to sign. I did not tell him I already knew Russian from school and from the markets in Riga. I signed and kept my mouth shut. Better to be a shadow at the start. We were marched into the yard, rows of Latvians, Estonians, Russians, even a few Jews from Tīreļpurvs, whose beards did not save them from the Tsar's hunger for men. Boots and tunics were thrown at us. Coarse, itchy wool that smelled of mothballs. Mine was 2 sizes too large, the belt cinched until the leather doubled over itself. The rifle they gave me was a Mosin Nagant, heavy and cold, its wooden stock gouged by other men's hands. I ran my fingers over the scars and wondered whose shoulder it had rested on last, and if that man had lived. Drill began at dawn. Commands in Russian snapped across the yard, and we stumbled through them, half understanding, half guessing. The sergeant's mustache bristled like bayonets as he roared insults. You peasants, you cows, the Kaiser will eat you alive. My shoulders ached from shouldering the rifle. My palms blistered from the shovel they shoved into our hands. Dig, march, shoot, dig again, sleep on straw that stank of sweat. Then repeat until even sleep felt like drill. Letters came from home in shaky script. My mother wrote of frost settling early, of rye cut short, of Elsa coming to help in the fields, though her own father scolded her. The land waits for you, she ended each letter, as though the fields might hold their breath until I returned. I kept her words in my tunic, folded so many times the paper wore thin. By September, the war had spread its cloak over us all. German armies had smashed the Russians at Tannenberg. Refugees poured eastward, their carts heaped with feather beds and pots, their eyes hollow. They said Courland was burning, that Jelgava was under German boots, that the Kaiser's men were already listening to the bells of Riga. I watched them pass through the city and felt the ground tilt beneath me. This was no distant war. It was here, in our soil. Our regiment boarded trains, long rattling carriages that smelled of tar and hay, and rolled toward the front. We sang at first, rough voices trying to remember old folk tunes, but by the second day, even the songs faltered. The countryside slid past in muted colours, villages shuttered, fields scarred by trenches that bit the earth like open mouths. At night, the horizon glowed with an orange smear, and we knew it was not sunrise. Near Šiauliai, we joined columns of men tramping down rutted roads. Russians in ragged coats, officers on horses, supply wagons creaking under shells. The roads churned into mud, and still we marched. My feet blistered until blood stained the wool socks. Beside me, another Latvian boy named Andrejs stumbled, and I hooked my arm under his to keep him upright. If we stop, they'll shoot us, he muttered, teeth clenched. I didn't doubt him. Our first brush with the Germans came not in battle, but in shells. One night, the sky split with thunder, and the earth shook so hard my teeth rattled. The horizon flashed white, then red, then white again. Horses screamed, men cursed, officers bellowed orders drowned by the roar. We huddled in a ditch, rifles clutched, waiting for death we could not see. When dawn came, the field nearby was gouged with craters. Trees snapped like kindling, and the air stank of powder. We walked among the torn earth and saw what shells did to men. I had thought myself hardened, but when I saw a body twisted like a broken scarecrow, I vomited into the mud. That autumn was mud and fear. We dug trenches in the swamps of Courland, water rising to our knees, lice biting until our skin bled. Food came late, sometimes not at all. Bread so hard it cracked teeth, soup with more water than cabbage. We huddled together under coats stiff with frost, telling stories of home to keep our teeth from chattering. Some nights, the Germans shouted across no man's land in broken Russian, mocking us, promising we would die before the winter passed. Yet among the misery, there was strange light. We Latvians found each other in the lines, our own language like a fire in the dark. We shared bread, swapped songs, cursed the officers under our breath. We were farm boys, factory men, students, all shoved into the same uniform. But when we spoke Latvian, we remembered who we were. It was in those trenches that talk began. Why should Latvians die for the Czar? Why not fight for our own land? At first they were whispers, quickly silenced if an officer passed. But the thought burned, and by winter it had a name, the Riflemen. A corps of Latvians for Latvians, to defend our soil against the Kaiser. The idea spread faster than lice. As the snows of 1914 settled, I pressed my back against frozen sandbags and stared out at a field of wire and shadow. Somewhere out there, the Germans dug their own holes. Their rifles pointed at us, their breath freezing like ours. I thought of my father's hands on my shoulders, of Elsa's blue scarf, of the Daugava murmuring its endless song. The empire might own my body, but my heart belonged to Latvia. And already, the storm was breaking. The spring of 1915 came late and raw, as if winter had decided to stay forever. Snow lingered in the swamps of Courland, and the trenches stank of rot and smoke. Word spread that the Germans were pressing hard, pushing east through Courland with artillery that roared like the sky itself was tearing open. Refugees streamed past our lines, farmers with ox carts, women dragging children half asleep, old men leaning on sticks. Their faces told us what the orders would not. Latvia itself was becoming the battlefield. We were thrown into the line near Jelgava. The officers barked Russian commands, but among ourselves we spoke Latvian. It mattered. The mud, the lice, the hunger, they were easier to bear when you heard your own tongue. We were not yet riflemen, but the name already clung to us. Latvieshu Strelniki. The Russian generals had not granted us such a unit, but in the trenches, the identity was already carved into our bones. Our baptism of fire came one morning in May. The mist lay thick on the fields, and the grass bent under frost. I remember the silence just before it began, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath. Then, without warning, the world erupted. German shells screamed overhead, tearing into our trenches, showering us with dirt, splinters, and blood. Men shrieked, shovels clattered, a horse reared and broke its neck against a wagon. The earth heaved under us as if it wanted to throw us off its back. "Rifles!" the sergeant bellowed, but half of us were already clutching them, knuckles white. I pressed the Mosin against my shoulder, heart hammering, mouth dry. Beside me, Andres crossed himself 3 times and muttered a prayer, his lips trembling. When the barrage lifted, we knew what it meant. They were coming. Out of the mist, shapes appeared, dark grey lines advancing with mechanical precision, bayonets glinting. The Germans. They seemed endless, like a tide that had decided to rise across the land. Our rifles cracked, the recoil jarring my shoulder, smoke filling my nose. Men dropped in the German line, but more stepped over them. Machine guns rattled, their chatter echoing like metal rain. I fired, reloaded, fired again, hardly aware of what I was doing. The mist was filled with shouts, some screams, and the sharp metallic taste of fear. Then they were in the wire. Grenades burst, flinging earth and bodies into the air. A German soldier vaulted into our trench, bayonet flashing, his eyes wild. I thrust my rifle forward, the bayonet finding his chest. His scream cut short, his body collapsed heavy against me. I shoved him aside, bile rising in my throat. The blood on my hands was hot even in the cold air. That was the first man I killed. His face has never left me. The line wavered, officers shouted, waving sabers uselessly in the smoke. Men broke and ran, stumbling through the mud, only to be cut down by German fire. For a moment, I thought we would be swallowed whole. But then something happened. Something that still burns in me when I remember. Latvian voices rose. Not Russian commands, not panicked cries, but our own tongue. Tīreļpurvs. Hold fast. The words cut through the smoke like a blade. We closed ranks, firing until our rifles steamed, throwing grenades until our arms shook. Besnik's voice carried above the roar, shouting, "Par Latviu!" For Latvia. And in that moment, the trench belonged to us. The Germans fell back, leaving the wire tangled with bodies. The mist closed again, carrying with it the stench of cordite and blood. We stood panting, rifles heavy, ears ringing. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the weapon. Andres vomited into the mud, then wiped his mouth and laughed a high, broken laugh. The officers later wrote reports, calling it a minor engagement. But for us, it was more than that. It was the day we proved ourselves. The day the name Latvian Riflemen ceased to be a whisper and became a fact. That night, we counted the missing. Too many. I walked among the wounded, their groans rising with the steam from their torn coats. One boy, no older than 16, clutched at my sleeve and begged for water. His blood soaked the earth dark. I gave him the last from my canteen, though I knew it would not save him. He died with his lips still wet. We buried them at dawn, the earth still trembling with distant guns. No priests, no hymns, just shovels and silence. When it was done, Besnik turned to me, his face grey with exhaustion. "We are no longer peasants," he said quietly. "We are soldiers now." I wanted to argue, to say we were still farm boys with dirt under our nails and songs in our hearts. But I knew he was right. The trenches had baptized us, not with water, but with fire and blood. And the war was only beginning. The Russian generals had not planned for us. To them, Latvians were just another province of the empire, good enough to bleed in the mud, but not to carry their own banner. Yet the war was devouring men faster than Moscow could send them. The Germans pressed through Courland, and Riga trembled. Refugees choked the roads. The barons packed their wagons, and still the front line shrank eastward. The Tsar's armies needed bodies that would not break. That was when the talk of a Latvian regiment became more than whispers. It began as petitions sent by our teachers and writers, by the sons of peasants and lawyers alike. "Let us defend our own land," they wrote. "Who else has more to lose?" At first, the generals scoffed. But by the autumn of 1915, with Jelgava fallen and the Germans at the gates of Riga, permission came down. Latvian volunteer rifle battalions would be formed. I still remember the day I signed my name. The paper was thin, the ink smudged, but the words felt heavier than any plow I had ever pushed. Latvian Rifle Battalion. I was no longer simply a peasant in the Russian army. I was part of something born of our own blood. The volunteers came in waves. Farmers with calloused hands, factory workers with soot still in their hair, students clutching books they had left half read. Some were boys of 16, lying about their age. Others were grey-bearded men who said they would not let their sons fight alone. Women came too, not to the front lines, but to carry messages, tend the wounded, and sew the red-white-red armbands that marked us as Latvian. In Riga, the city square filled with them. Old women wept and pressed bread into our hands. Children touched our rifles as if they were talismans. The black double-headed eagle of the Czar still flew above the barracks, but in our hearts another eagle stretched its wings. The white one from our folk songs, the one that carried freedom on its back. Training was a chaos of languages. Russian officers barked orders none of us cared to follow, while our sergeants translated into Latvian with curses and jokes that made us laugh even in the mud. We learned to move as a unit, to fire and reload in rhythm, to charge when the whistle blew. We were not polished like the Tsar's guards, but we were fierce, and we fought as though the earth itself were ours to defend. The first time we wore our new armbands, red, white, red stitched against grey wool, a murmur passed through the ranks. It was not yet a flag, but it was a promise. Now, Andres whispered beside me, they will know we are Latvians. I touched the cloth on my sleeve and felt a fire kindle in my chest. The front awaited us soon enough. The Germans had dug in across the marshes of Tīreļpurvs, their trenches bristling with wire and guns. The Russians needed men who would not run, who would stand in knee-deep snow and fight until only ghosts remained. That was to be us. Our first march as riflemen was through frozen fields, snow squeaking under our boots, rifles slung across our shoulders. Villagers stepped from their cottages to watch us pass. Some crossed themselves, others waved weakly, their faces pale from hunger. I saw Elsa among them, her blue scarf bright against the white world. She smiled, though her eyes were wet. I wanted to run to her, to hold her hand once more, but the column moved on, and I dared not break. At night in the trenches, we sang. Not Russian marching songs, but Latvian folk tunes, diners whispered by our grandmothers. The melodies drifted over the snow, strange and haunting, carrying across no man's land. The Germans sometimes shouted back, mocking us, but we sang louder. In the darkness, with frost clinging to our beards and lice biting our necks, the songs reminded us we were still human. Still Latvian. The officers noticed. They wrote reports that the Latvians fought with unusual tenacity, that we held lines others abandoned. But to us, it was simple. Every trench we defended was a step closer to home. Every field of snow was soil we had ploughed. Every tree line was a forest we had hunted. The Empire had conscripted us, but it was Latvia we were defending. That winter, the riflemen were blooded in skirmishes along the Tīreļpurvs. Small fights compared to what was coming, but enough to prove ourselves. We attacked through knee-deep snow, firing until our rifles froze, charging with bayonets when the bullets ran dry. The Germans called us Teufelsträger, devil bearers, for the way we came screaming through the night. We lost many, but we never broke. When we buried our dead, we wrapped them in blankets from home and carved their names into wooden crosses with knives. They will not be forgotten, Besnik swore, his voice raw. And we believed him, because in our hearts we knew, Something had been born among us that could not be erased. The riflemen were no longer a rumor. We were a fact carved in snow and blood. And soon, the Empire would call on us to do the impossible. The winter of 1915 sank its teeth into us and did not let go. By December, the trenches around Tīreļpurvs had turned into frozen coffins. Snow drifted high against the parapets, and the swamp water beneath the ice seeped into our boots until our feet felt like wood. Some mornings, we woke with our coats stiff as boards, our beards coated in frost. Men cursed the cold until their lips cracked and bled. The trenches were narrow scars gouged into the swamp, lined with logs and frozen mud. When the wind howled, snow blew in, burying rifles and bodies alike. The Russians sent us orders and little else. Bread came hard as stone, soup thin as water, and sometimes there was nothing at all. We chewed on frozen beets, gnawed horsehide, boiled bark when the hunger turned savage. I learned the taste of starvation as keenly as I knew the sound of shells. And yet, amid the misery, there was life. At night, we huddled together under torn blankets, trading stories to keep the dark away. Andres could always make us laugh, imitating the pompous Russian officers, puffing his chest and shouting in broken Russian, until even the most exhausted of us smiled. Besnik carved whistles and flutes from wood scraps, and though his music was thin and shaky in the frozen air, it reminded us of home. The lice were constant. We scratched until our skin bled, shaking our shirts over fire to hear the tiny bodies pop. Disease stalked us more than German bullets, dysentery, trench foot, fever. Men wasted away, their eyes hollow, their breath steaming in the cold. When one of ours died, we buried him in the snow, marking the grave with a simple wooden cross. There were no priests, no hymns, only silence and frost. Still, there were moments when we forgot. At Christmas of 1915, we lit a candle in a bottle and sang the old carols. The light flickered across our gaunt faces, casting shadows on the trench walls. From across no man's land, faintly, we heard the Germans singing, too. Different words, same melody. For a moment, the war softened, and we were simply men longing for home. Then a flare went up, and the machine guns rattled, and the spell was broken. The riflemen earned a reputation in those months. When others faltered, we held. When the Russians doubted, we stood fast. We were bound by more than orders. We were Latvians, defending the last scraps of our land. We fought not for the Czar, but for the soil under our boots, for the birches and rivers that had raised us. That gave us strength the Empire could not understand. Our patrols through the swamp were nightmares. At night, we waded waist-deep in freezing water, rifles above our heads, ears straining for the crunch of German boots. Sometimes we caught them, grey-clad shadows moving through the reeds. Then the knives came out, and the swamp went silent except for a splash and a muffled cry. Those who returned never spoke of what happened in the dark. Letters from home were treasures, read until the paper wore thin. My mother wrote of hunger, of fields left unploughed, of neighbours taken east by the gendarmes for speaking too boldly. Elsa's letters were shorter, but each word burned bright. "We wait for you," she wrote once, her hand trembling on the page. I carried those words against my chest through every frost-bitten night. By early 1916, we had become hard men. Our faces were lean, our eyes hollow but sharp. The cold had carved us, the hunger had tempered us, the trenches had bound us into something more than soldiers. We were brothers in a way no oath could match. We bled together, starved together, sang together. One night, as snow fell silent over the swamp, Andres leaned against the parapet beside me. "They'll throw us at the Germans soon," he said. His breath clouded in the dark. "And half of us won't come back." I looked at him, at his frostbitten fingers wrapped around the rifle, at the hollow cheeks that had once been full of laughter. "Then we'll fight until we can't," I answered. My words felt heavy, but they were true. He nodded, and for a moment we both listened to the silence of the frozen world. The Empire thought the riflemen were tools to be used. They did not understand that in the swamps of Tīreļpurvs, in those frozen trenches, something else was being forged. Something that would either die in the snow or rise with fire. The swamp at Tīreļpurvs was a graveyard waiting for its dead. We had lived in it for more than a year, watching the Germans dig deeper, build stronger, stretch wire across the ice like a spider's web. Every rumor said a great push was coming, that the Empire would drive the Kaiser's men from our soil once and for all. We did not cheer. We had seen too much to believe in promises. Still, when the order came in December, a strange fire burned through us. The riflemen would lead the assault. At last, the Empire admitted what we already knew. When others faltered, Latvians did not. We would strike through the swamp, break the German line near Ložmetē, and open the way for the Russians to advance. It was madness. We all knew it, but it was ours to carry. The night before the attack, the sky hung low and heavy, snow falling thick enough to swallow sound. In the trenches, we shared what little we had: a crust of bread, a swallow of vodka, a song sung softly so the Germans could not hear. Beside me, Andres shivered, his scarf pulled tight. "Tomorrow," he said, "either heroes or ghosts." Besnik gave a bitter laugh. "Maybe both." At dawn, on the 23rd of December, old-style calendar, the guns opened. Russian artillery thundered for hours, tearing at the German wire, churning the swamp into smoke and blood. We pressed against the parapets, rifles ready, bayonets fixed, breath freezing in our beards. My hands trembled, not from cold, but from the knowledge that when the guns stopped, it would be our turn. Then the whistles blew. We surged over the top, into snow and smoke and fire. The swamp swallowed us, ice cracking beneath our boots, bullets whining overhead. Men fell screaming into the black water, their cries cut short as the swamp closed over them. Machine guns rattled from the German lines, mowing us down in swaths. Still we ran, stumbling, clawing, pushing forward. The wire loomed, tangled and deadly. In the smoke, we saw gaps torn by artillery, but too few. Men hurled themselves against it, dragging it down with their bodies, clearing paths with their own flesh. We followed, stepping over corpses, firing into flashes of grey. I remember the face of the first German I met in the trench, eyes wide, helmet askew, rifle clutched desperately. He fired, missed, and I drove my bayonet into him before I could think. The force of it jarred my arms, the heat of his blood soaking my gloves. He gasped once and fell. My stomach lurched, but my arms moved again and again. There was no time to feel. The trench became a slaughterhouse. Grenades burst, earth and bone flying together. Smoke stung our eyes, screams filled our ears. We fought with rifles, shovels, knives, bare hands. Men slipped in blood, clawed their way up, fought on. I saw Andres rip a rifle from a German's grip and smash his skull with the butt. I saw Besnik, blood on his cheek, dragging a wounded comrade out of the mud while bullets cut the air around him. By nightfall, we held parts of the German line. Fires burned in the swamp, bodies lay frozen in grotesque shapes. The snow stained red. The air reeked of powder, blood, and smoke. We were alive, but too many were not. Our battalions had been cut in half. Whole companies were gone. The generals called it a victory. They wrote dispatches praising our courage, boasting of ground gained. But when we looked at the heaps of bodies, our brothers, our friends, we knew the truth. Victory had a taste like ashes. On Christmas night, the snow fell silent over the battlefield, covering corpses with a white shroud. We sat in captured trenches, too exhausted to eat, too hollow to speak. Andres leaned against the wall, eyes sunken, whispering. We left our souls in the swamp. I said nothing. He was right. In the villages, they would sing of our courage, call us heroes. But in the swamp of Tīreļpurvs, in the frozen blood and shattered wire, we knew another name, sacrifice. And it was only the beginning. We thought the Christmas battles had drained the swamp of life enough, but the generals were not finished with us. Barely weeks had passed before the order came again. Another assault, another push against the German lines at Tīreļpurvs. The ink on our comrades' graves had not yet dried, and already the empire demanded more blood. It was January 1917, the coldest I can remember. Snow crusted hard as iron, the swamp frozen solid beneath our boots. At night, frost rimed our rifles so thick that bolts seized unless we warmed them with our hands. Men coughed blood from lungs cracked by cold air. But when the officers read the orders, we said nothing. We were Latvians, the riflemen. If we refused, who else would stand? The artillery opened before dawn, a pounding that rattled the earth and shook ice from the trees. We huddled at the parapets, our breath rising in clouds. Rifles ready, bayonets gleaming faintly in the grey. Beside me, Andres murmured the Lord's Prayer under his breath. His lips moved faster than the words could form. I wanted to join him, but my throat was dry as bone. Then came the whistle. We climbed out of the trench into a world of fire and frost. Snow exploded around us as shells crashed down. Machine guns rattled from the German lines, tearing into us. Men pitched forward, crimson blossoming across white coats. Still we ran, boots crunching, hearts hammering. The swamp that had swallowed us in December now became a killing ground, flat and merciless. I remember the sky, pale, almost beautiful, as though mocking us, and under it, the storm of bullets. We reached the wire. Some gaps had been blown, but others still stood, cruel teeth of twisted metal. Men flung themselves onto it, their bodies bridging the way. I heard one scream, his voice rising above the roar until it ended with a sickening gurgle. We clambered over him, firing into flashes of grey. The Germans met us with everything they had: rifles, machine guns, grenades hurled from their trenches. The air was thick with smoke and screams. I fired until my shoulder burned, stabbed until my arms shook, fought with fists when nothing else remained. At one point, a German lunged at me with a bayonet. I barely deflected it, the steel slicing across my coat. Andrzej struck him down with a shovel, his face twisted with fury. "Not today," he spat, though his hands were shaking. We took part of the line, but the cost was unbearable. Men fell in heaps, the snow black with blood. By nightfall, whole battalions had been gutted. Of the boys I had trained with in Riga, half were gone. Their names rang in my head like church bells: Pīteris, Jēkabs, Ilmars, each one a voice silenced forever in the swamp. The Russians called it a victory. They said we had broken the Germans' defenses, gained precious ground. But we knew better. The riflemen had been thrown into the grinder, and the empire had ground us down. Out of our 8 battalions, thousands lay dead or maimed. That night, as we sat in the captured trench, I looked at Andres. His face was hollow, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling. How many more times? he whispered. I had no answer. When Besnik returned from carrying the wounded, his coat soaked in blood, not his own, he said quietly, "They don't care how many of us die, as long as we die where they point." His voice was flat, emptied of rage. That terrified me more than the battle. And yet, amid the despair, something else smoldered. Whispers spread among us. If the Empire treated us as expendable, why should we fight for it? The word freedom was no longer just in songs. It was on our lips, raw and bitter. We were riflemen, forged in snow and blood. We had fought the Germans, yes, but now we began to see the Tsar's shadow for what it was, another chain around our necks. The January offensive left the swamp littered with corpses, frozen in grotesque shapes, snow drifting over them like a shroud. We survived, but something inside us cracked. The Empire had bled us dry, and in that crack, something new began to grow. The guns did not fall silent after the January slaughter, but something else did, the Empire itself. By March, the news reached us, even in the frozen swamps. Petrograd was burning with crowds, soldiers mutinied, the Tsar had abdicated. At first, we didn't believe it. An empire so vast, so terrible, could not simply collapse. But the officers who once barked orders now spoke with trembling voices, and the supply trains that had always been late stopped coming altogether. Discipline cracked like ice in spring. In our trenches, the men no longer stood at attention when Russian officers passed. Instead, they laughed, muttered, or walked away. Orders written in neat Russian script found their way into the mud. The soldiers' Soviets rose overnight. Meetings of privates and corporals who voted on what orders to obey. The Empire had ruled with fear, but fear was melting fast. For the riflemen, it was confusion and awakening at once. We had given everything, our youth, our blood, our brothers, for the Tsar, and now he was gone, vanishing like a shadow at dawn. In his place came promises from Petrograd: freedom, democracy, bread, peace. Some believed them, others spat, and said Russia had only changed masks. I remember one night in April. We sat around a small fire, flames licking weakly at damp wood. Andres stared into the smoke and said, "If there is no Tsar, why do we stay in these trenches? Why not go home?" Besnik answered with a bitter laugh. "Because the Germans will come, and then there will be no home to return to." I sat silent, feeling the truth in both their words. The Germans sensed the fracture. Their patrols pressed harder, their shells fell heavier. Yet more dangerous than the enemy in front of us was the split among ourselves. Some riflemen began to speak of the Bolsheviks, of Lenin and his promise to end the war. Others cursed the very idea, saying it was betrayal to leave Latvia to the Kaiser. Arguments flared, fists flew. Brothers who had stood shoulder to shoulder at Tīreļpurvs now eyed each other with suspicion. In Riga, demonstrations filled the streets. The red flags rose, voices shouting for revolution. Yet others shouted for Latvia itself, for a land free not only of Germans, but of Russians too. It was as if the earth beneath us had shifted, and no one knew where it would stop. That summer, orders came for us to attack again, but half the battalions refused. Men voted to stay in the trenches, waving resolutions signed in the name of the Soviet. Others went forward reluctantly, fighting not for empire, but for the soil under their boots. The generals cursed us as unreliable. Yet when the Germans advanced, they still threw Latvians at them, knowing we would hold longer than most. The sense of betrayal deepened. We bled, and Russia wavered. In the streets of Petrograd, they argued about ideology. In the swamps of Latvia, we buried our dead. One evening, a Russian officer tried to rally us with talk of honor and duty. His words were thin, his voice unsteady. When he finished, silence hung in the trench. Then a rifleman named Edwards spoke, his voice rough but clear. "We fight for Latvia, not for you." The men around him nodded. The officer went pale and walked away. By autumn, Riga itself was lost. The Germans stormed across the Daugava, shells turning the city into ruins. Smoke choked the sky, and we retreated east, watching our homeland swallowed by grey uniforms and iron crosses. The people we had sworn to protect were left behind, trapped under occupation. It was the deepest wound of all. I still see it, the black eagle of the Germans flying over Riga, the city where I had first signed my name as a rifleman. I felt hollow, as though a piece of me had been carved out and carried away. That winter, we huddled again in trenches far from home. But the talk was no longer of victory. It was of survival, of politics, of which banner to follow when the empire itself had fallen to pieces. Some swore by the Bolsheviks, saying they would bring peace. Others swore at them, vowing to fight for an independent Latvia if the chance ever came. We had been forged in blood as brothers. But now, revolution had planted knives in our hands, and none of us knew at whom we would be asked to turn them. The betrayal was not only from Russia. It was within ourselves, a fracture that cut deeper than any German shell. And I feared that the swamp would not only bury our bodies, but also our dreams of freedom. When the new year came, we no longer wore the Tsar's crown on our buttons. It had been torn away with the empire itself. In its place was confusion, red flags, new speeches, promises whispered across frozen camps. The old order was gone, but what was left in its place was chaos. The Bolsheviks moved quickly. They offered us bread, land, and the end of war. "Comrades," their commissars called us, standing on crates in muddy camps. "You have bled for the Tsar. Now fight for yourselves, for the workers and peasants." Some riflemen cheered. Others spat in the mud. For us Latvians, the choice was sharper than for the Russians. The Germans still held our homeland, their boots crushing Riga's cobblestones, their banners flying over Jelgava and Liepāja. The Bolsheviks promised to drive them out, but they also spoke of a world without nations, without Latvia. Independence was on the lips of men in the cafes of Petrograd and whispered in the trenches, but it was fragile as thin ice. The split came slowly, then all at once. Some of my comrades donned red armbands, swearing to the Bolsheviks. They said the revolution was the only road forward, that without it, we would be slaves to Germans or barons forever. Others shook their heads, saying the Bolsheviks would only replace one master with another. They spoke instead of a free Latvia, a land of our own. I watched Andres wrestle with the choice. His family had starved under both Tsar and German, his father beaten by baron stewards, his mother left with nothing. "The Bolsheviks at least promise food," he muttered, staring into the fire. "What has Latvia given me but graves?" Besnik answered sharply, "Latvia is not a promise, it is us. If we do not fight for her now, she will never be born." I said nothing. My heart pulled both ways, torn between hunger and hope. In the spring, the Germans pushed again, emboldened by Russia's collapse. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk handed them half of our homeland as if it were nothing but lines on paper. Rage burned in us. We had fought in the swamps, buried brothers in the snow, and now diplomats in far-off cities carved Latvia into pieces without a thought. That was the final betrayal. The Latvian Riflemen who joined the Bolsheviks became famous, feared across Russia. They guarded Lenin himself, their discipline and ferocity unmatched. The Red Latvian, they were called. Devil soldiers who stormed palaces and crushed uprisings. I saw comrades who had once sung folk songs in the trenches, now shouting slogans. Their rifles turned on other Russians. Others deserted, slipping away to find their way back home. Some joined underground movements for independence, gathering weapons, waiting for the day when Germany would falter and Latvia could rise. They carried no banner but the memory of the red, white, red, whispered of since 1905, stitched in secret on armbands. As for me, I lingered in the middle, unable to choose. My rifle was still heavy in my hands, my boots still caked with the mud of Russia's endless front. At night, I dreamed of the Daugava, of Elsa's blue scarf, of fields left untended. I wanted only to return. But return to what? A Latvia under German heel? A Latvia swallowed by Bolshevik slogans? Or a Latvia that did not yet exist, fragile as smoke? One evening, as snow melted into muck, Besnik pressed his hand on my shoulder. "Johnny," he said, "the time will come when we must choose, red or white. But never forget, we are Latvians first. That is the only truth that matters." His voice was quiet but steady, like a prayer. By summer, the battalions that had once marched as brothers were scattered. Some rode trains east to fight for Lenin. Others slipped west, vanishing into the forests. A few, too weary to choose, laid down their rifles altogether. The riflemen were no longer one. We had been forged in snow and fire, but now we were cracked, splintered, broken against the wheel of history. Yet I believed, deep inside, that something remained. The dream of Latvia itself. A land not German, not Russian, not red, not white, but ours. That dream still flickered in the smoke, fragile but unextinguished. And as long as one man carried it in his heart, Latvia still lived. The war that had begun with the Tsar's banners and German shells did not end when the rifles fell silent on the Western Front. For us, it twisted into something new, a war for the very soul of Latvia. I came home in 1919, though home was no longer the word. The village I had left in 1914 was a ruin. The manor had been shelled, its windows shattered, its stone walls blackened. Our cottage roof sagged, the fields lay unplowed, the fences broken. My mother was gone, dead of hunger. The neighbors whispered. My father's grave was marked by a wooden cross tilted in the snow. And Elsa, the girl with the blue scarf, had vanished into the tide of refugees. I searched for her in Riga, but the city was a storm. Red Guards patrolled one street, German Freikorps another, independence fighters in between. People disappeared as quickly as they appeared, swallowed by the chaos. Latvia was tearing itself from empire, but every hand pulled at a different direction. In 1918, independence was proclaimed. Red, white, red flag unfurled at last over Riga. But almost at once, the land became a battlefield again. Bolshevik troops poured in from the east, their ranks filled with men I had once called brother, Latvian riflemen, who now guarded Lenin's revolution. From the west came Germans, first as conquerors, then as mercenaries wearing new insignia. Between them, the independence fighters, the Landeswehr, the national units, and ragged volunteers clutching whatever rifles they could find, fought for a Latvia that existed only on paper. I could not stay aside. I joined the independence forces under Kārlis Ulmanis, though my heart felt torn. I had stood in the swamps with the men who now marched under the red banner of the Bolsheviks. To raise a rifle against them was to raise it against my own past. But to do nothing was to let Latvia die before she drew her first true breath. The fighting was brutal and confused. In 1919, we battled the Red Riflemen outside Riga. snow fell thick, muffling the clash of rifles and the screams of the wounded. I recognized faces across the field, men I had sung with in the trenches of Tīreļpurvs, men I had buried comrades beside. Now they aimed rifles at me. Once, in the chaos of a charge, I found myself staring down the barrel of a gun held by Tīreļpurvs, a boy I had known since training days. His eyes widened with recognition, but neither of us fired. A second later, the press of battle shoved us apart, and I never saw him again. The Germans too carved their bloody mark. In the summer, their Freikorps turned on us, trying to strangle independence in its cradle. Villages burned, partisans hanged from trees. But we fought back, side by side with Estonians, and our own farmers turned soldiers, until the Freikorps were broken at Cēsis. That victory felt like a sunrise after years of storm. For the first time, I truly believed Latvia might live. By 1920, the front shifted east again. The Independence Army, strengthened with volunteers and foreign support, pushed back the Bolsheviks. The fighting was savage. Bayonet charges through forests, machine guns rattling over fields of rye. But the Reds retreated, and with each step, the red-white-red flag advanced. When the peace treaty was signed in Riga in 1920, Latvia was at last free, a nation born in fire, baptized in blood. And yet, for me, peace was not peace. Too many ghosts walked beside me. Andres had joined the Reds, and I never learned his fate. Besnik fought with me through the final campaigns, but he did not return, cut down near Lavani by a burst of machine gun fire. I buried him beneath a birch tree, carving his name into the bark with my knife. I still hear his laughter in the wind sometimes, carried like the notes of his wooden flute. I am alive, though I often ask why. I sit now in a rebuilt village, the fields green again, children's laughter echoing where once there had been only silence. Latvia lives, and for that I am grateful. But when I close my eyes, I see the swamp at Tīreļpurvs, the snow stained red, the faces of the riflemen who never saw this dawn. We were peasants once, then soldiers, then riflemen. We fought for an empire, then against it, then for a dream that finally became real. But the cost was everything we had. Latvia is free, yes, but she was bought with our blood. And I carry that weight with me every day, until I too join the brothers who wait beneath the birches.